The night of December 24th was like any other winter evening, but tonight the snow fell heavier than ever. A thick blanket of white covered the streets, muffling any sound. The world outside was quiet. The only movement the swirling wind, which seemed to weave through the empty street like a forgotten whisper. Christmas lights adorned every window, casting a soft, warm glow from the inside. But outside, the cold was relentless, as though the night itself had a bitter edge. In front of one of the houses, the warmth and cheer of the season couldn't reach a small figure huddled alone on the porch. Lucas, only 6 years old, sat frozen on the top step. His hands were clenched tightly to his sides, his breath visible in the freezing air, forming small clouds in the still night. He wore an old navy sweater too big for him, its fabric worn thin with time, and a pair of shoes that barely fit. The cold seeped through him, his legs trembling, but he didn't cry. He had learned long ago that crying only made things worse. Behind him, the house remained silent, its windows glowing warmly with Christmas lights. From the outside, it looked like a typical Christmas scene, a home filled with warmth and family. Inside, however, there was no laughter, no festive cheer, no sign of the family he once knew. There were only the faint sounds of muffled voices and the harsh silence that followed when the door slammed shut. Lucas stared at the door as if hoping, waiting for it to open again. But he knew better. His little hands, red from the cold, trembled as he knocked softly, once, then again. But there was no response. No one came to check. He could hear the faint sound of the Christmas music playing from inside, but it was distant, as though it belonged to another world. He pulled his knees closer to his chest, trying to make himself as small as possible, just like he always did when he was afraid. The house was still, the lights shining brightly, but it felt so far away. The snow continued to fall, and the cold dug deeper into his bones. The warmth inside was a cruel reminder of what he didn't have, what he never could have. The world around him felt so vast, yet so empty. The houses nearby were all tucked in with families, warm and safe, and yet here he was, alone in the snow. Lucas sat there for what felt like hours, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't express, his small body curled into itself against the cold. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, and the sound seemed to sting his ears. The snow covered his shoes, slowly creeping up his legs, but still, he stayed silent. He wasn't sure if he was hoping for something to change or if he had simply given up on expecting anything at all. It was Christmas Eve, but all the magic of the night felt out of reach. The only thing that surrounded him was the endless quiet and the cold that pressed in heavier with each passing minute. And still, he remained there, waiting, hoping, but knowing that things would never be the same. Sarah Miller hadn't always been like this. Before her marriage to Lucas's father, she was known as a polite, reserved woman, ambitious and focused on her career. Neighbors described her as distant but friendly, the type of person who always kept her life in perfect order. She worked in property management and valued structure, discipline, and control in all aspects of her life. But that all changed after the accident that took Lucas's father away. When Sarah's husband, Michael, died in a tragic construction accident 2 years ago, something in her broke. The loss was overwhelming, and she was forced to carry the weight of both grief and responsibility. As the sole guardian of Lucas, her heart hardened. The little boy who had once been her husband's joy now seemed like a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Her patience for him quickly wore thin. The once polite woman became irritable, cold, and withdrawn. She no longer showed affection for Lucas. She viewed him as a burden she had not chosen, a living reminder of the man she had loved and lost. Her earlier tenderness and care were replaced by resentment, a quiet but ever-present frustration that built up over time. Lucas had learned early on that his presence was an inconvenience to Sarah. Her eyes grew sharper whenever he entered the room, her words shorter, her actions more detached. It was as if every move he made irritated her. Every question he asked was a nuisance. Lucas never felt like he belonged. The house no longer felt like home. just a place where he was tolerated, not loved. Tonight, everything came to a head. Sarah had spent the afternoon preparing the house for Christmas, a task she had begrudgingly taken on because it was expected. But nothing about it brought her joy anymore. The festive lights, the decorations, none of it mattered. As she hung the ornaments, she thought about how everything was falling apart, how her life had turned into a series of duties she had to fulfill without choice. And Lucas was always in the way. As the night wore on, Sarah's frustration grew. She had been feeling the pressure all day, the constant reminder that her life wasn't what it had been, that she was alone. The weight of raising Lucas alone without the help or support of her husband was becoming unbearable. The house, despite its festive trimmings, felt like a prison, and Lucas, standing in the doorway asking for something as simple as a little warmth, was the last straw. "Get out!" Sarah snapped, her voice cutting through the Christmas music playing softly in the background. The words came out harsh, sharp, and final. "I don't want to see you anymore." Lucas's small body flinched at the sound of her voice. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped, though he shouldn't have, that maybe tonight, just tonight, he could feel like he belonged. But there was no kindness in Sarah's eyes, only irritation. His lip trembled, but no words came out. He didn't know how to ask for something he had been denied for so long. His hands clenched at his sides, his heart racing. "I'll be good," he whispered, barely audible, tears threatening to spill. "I promise." Sarah exhaled sharply, almost like the sound of her breath annoyed her more than anything. She took 2 quick steps toward him, grabbing his arm firmly. It wasn't violent, but the force of her grip sent a chill through Lucas. She didn't say anything else as she pulled him toward the door. The moment they reached the front door, Sarah swung it open. A blast of icy cold air rushed into the house. The porch light flickered, casting an eerie, harsh light on the steps outside. Lucas stumbled as she pushed him, his feet slipping on the rug beneath him. He fell hard onto the wooden porch steps, the cold instantly biting into his skin. The door slammed shut behind him, and the unmistakable click of the lock turning echoed through the night. Lucas didn't move at first. He stayed frozen on the steps, staring at the door as if it might open again. His breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale visible in the freezing air. His small body shivered uncontrollably as he pulled his knees to his chest, trying to warm himself. He had learned not to cry, not to make any noise. The silence was safer, even though the cold was unbearable. But this time, it was different. He was alone in a world that seemed so much bigger than him, a world that had never really been kind. Tony had just returned home after a long deployment. The days he had spent abroad, away from the familiar streets and comforting sounds of home, had felt like an eternity. As he walked down the quiet, snow-covered streets of his neighborhood, there was a peace that he hadn't known in months. His boots crunched softly on the snow, each step a welcome reminder of the simple, steady life he had missed. Buddy, his German shepherd, walked beside him, the leash relaxed in Tony's hand. Buddy was a highly trained working dog, a companion through thick and thin. The dog's thick black and tan coat was dusted with snowflakes, his body moving with practiced grace as he kept a steady pace beside Tony. His ears were perked, his eyes sharp, scanning their surroundings with a calm vigilance. He was a dog of quiet confidence, always alert, always aware. The night was serene, yet there was something different about it. Christmas lights twinkled from houses along the street, casting a warm, festive glow against the cold backdrop of the winter evening. But the wind, biting and unforgiving, whipped through the trees, causing the snow to swirl and dance in the air. The stillness of the night was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Tony took a deep breath, letting the cool, crisp air fill his lungs. The quiet was a welcome change from the noise of war, from the chaos of the battlefield. It was a simple, peaceful night, but something in the air seemed off. As they walked, Buddy's body stiffened slightly, the dog's head turned toward a row of houses up ahead, his movement sharp and deliberate. Tony noticed immediately. It was as if Buddy had sensed something that wasn't quite right. Buddy stopped walking, his ears swiveling as he focused on something ahead. Tony stopped beside him, feeling a subtle shift in the atmosphere. There was nothing overtly wrong, no obvious danger, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet. No laughter drifted from the windows, no sounds of families gathering. Only the soft hum of the wind and the sound of their footsteps in the snow filled the silence. Buddy growled low in his throat, his body tense. Tony's grip on the leash tightened slightly, his instincts kicking in. The dog was not a creature prone to unnecessary aggression, but his keen senses always picked up on things that Tony couldn't. The leash tugged slightly as Buddy started to pull forward, his gaze locked on a house farther down the street. It wasn't a sound or a movement that had caught Buddy's attention. It was something else. A feeling, a presence, maybe even an absence. "Come on, Buddy," Tony murmured, gently tugging on the leash to guide the dog forward. But Buddy refused to budge. His eyes remained fixed, his growl growing slightly louder, more insistent. Tony looked down the street, his mind racing. What could Buddy be sensing? As he stood there, the wind biting at his face, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His soldier instincts, honed from years of service, were telling him to stay alert. He glanced up at the house Buddy was fixated on. A small, modest home decorated with Christmas lights, but the windows were dark. No movement, no sign of life. It looked ordinary, but there was something in the stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Buddy's growl stopped suddenly, and the dog shifted his stance, now completely still, his focus unwavering. Tony felt his pulse quicken as he tried to decide whether to investigate further or move on. But before he could make up his mind, Buddy took another step toward the house, pulling Tony along with him. Something in the air had shifted, and Tony, ever trusting in his dog's instincts, followed without hesitation. The snow continued to fall, thick and steady, coating everything in a layer of white. The night seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to unfold. Tony's feet crunched softly in the snow as he followed Buddy, who had now pulled ahead with an urgency that Tony couldn't ignore. The wind continued to whip through the quiet street, carrying with it the sense that something was about to happen, something neither he nor Buddy could quite name, but both could feel. They approached the house, a small, unremarkable home tucked between others on the street. The Christmas lights wrapped around the porch glowed brightly, casting a soft warmth that contrasted with the icy air. Yet the windows were dark. No shadows moved behind the glass. No sign of life. Just a stillness that seemed to fill the space around it. The kind of stillness that made Tony's soldier instincts flare to life. Buddy, usually calm and controlled, was now hyper-alert. His nose was to the ground, eyes fixed forward, and his body tense. Tony instinctively tightened his grip on the leash. There was something unsettling about the house, something off about the way it sat in the night, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they drew closer, Buddy stopped, his growl low and steady. Tony halted, sensing that the dog's instincts were pulling him towards something hidden behind the closed doors of the house. Buddy took another step forward, and Tony followed without hesitation. His military training told him to always listen to his gut, and right now, every part of him screamed that something wasn't right. They rounded the corner of the porch, and that's when Tony saw him. There, on the top step of the porch, sat a small figure, hunched and into itself, surrounded by the quiet white blanket of snow. The figure didn't move, didn't look up at them as they approached, and it took Tony a moment to realize the figure was a child. Lucas. The boy was dressed in a navy blue sweater that looked far too big for him, and his jeans, frayed at the hems, were stained with dirt and snow. His small body trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something more unsettling. The boy was curled into himself, as if trying to make himself invisible to the world. His breath came in short, quick bursts, visible in the cold air as tiny puffs of steam. But it wasn't just the cold that made Tony's heart tighten. It was the stillness in which the boy sat. Tony's heart skipped a beat. His first reaction was a mix of confusion and concern. Why was this child out here alone in the freezing cold on Christmas Eve? The sight of the boy sitting there, so small, so vulnerable, cut through him like a blade. Buddy, sensing Tony's rising concern, stepped forward, sitting beside the boy, his large frame a comforting presence. Lucas didn't flinch at Buddy's approach, but his eyes remained focused on the ground, his body rigid with fear, as if he didn't want to be noticed. Tony knelt down slowly, his voice soft and steady. "Hey, kid," Tony said gently, "are you okay?" The boy didn't answer. Tony reached out slightly but stopped himself just short of touching him. He knew better than to approach too quickly, especially with a child who was clearly frightened. Instead, he gave Buddy a quick glance. The dog, in his quiet, reassuring way, tilted his head toward Lucas, offering a silent promise of safety. Tony tried again, his voice even more patient this time. "It's all right, you're safe now. What's your name?" Lucas lifted his eyes just enough to meet Tony's gaze. The look in those eyes, wide, full of fear and exhaustion, hit Tony harder than he expected. The boy's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, a single tear slipped down his cheek, freezing almost immediately in the cold air. It was a silent cry, one that spoke volumes more than any words could. Tony's heart clenched. Something was terribly wrong. The boy was alone, out here in the cold, without a sign of anyone caring for him. "Hey, it's okay," Tony whispered again, his voice full of reassurance. "You're not alone anymore. I won't let anything happen to you." Buddy sat down, his eyes never leaving the boy, as if he understood that Tony was trying to connect with him, trying to help. The dog's calm presence seemed to ease the tension in the air, and for the first time Lucas relaxed just slightly. The trembling in his body lessened, but the fear remained. Tony didn't push further. He stayed where he was, giving Lucas the space to feel safe. Something told him that the boy wasn't ready to speak, not yet. But Tony knew that getting him to safety, away from the cold, was the first step. As Tony helped Lucas to his feet, Buddy gently nudged the boy's hand with his nose. The boy hesitated, but then slowly placed his hand on Buddy's fur. It was a small gesture, but it was a beginning. Lucas was starting to trust, starting to feel that someone cared. Tony helped Lucas to his feet, the boy's small frame feeling fragile in his hands. The moment Lucas was standing, Buddy moved closer, nudging the boy gently with his head. Lucas flinched at first, but the dog's warm, steady presence seemed to offer him something familiar, something to hold on to. Tony stood back slightly, giving Lucas the space he needed to adjust. His heart ached as he watched the boy, who was clearly trying to find comfort in a world that had not been kind to him. The cold air continued to bite at them, but Tony's thoughts were on Lucas's silent form and the deep, unspoken fear in his eyes. "Hey, it's okay," Tony said softly, his voice as calm and steady as he could make it. "You're safe now. You don't have to be scared anymore." Lucas's eyes stayed fixed on Buddy, his body tense, but Tony noticed a slight shift. The boy wasn't looking at him, not yet, but the way he studied Buddy, the way his trembling hands slowly relaxed, told Tony that the dog was helping, even if the boy didn't realize it. Tony didn't push. He understood that Lucas wasn't ready to speak. The boy was still lost in his world of fear and confusion, unsure if he could trust the man and dog before him. Tony could feel it. The hesitation, the walls Lucas had built up to protect himself from further hurt. So instead of pressing the boy for answers or rushing him, Tony chose to simply stay there, offering his presence and support. Buddy sat down at Lucas's feet, still focused but not pushing. The dog's eyes were soft, his posture relaxed but alert. It was as if Buddy understood that the journey to earning Lucas's trust wasn't something that could happen in an instant. Tony knew that too. They had time. And for now, time meant waiting. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Tony could see Lucas's small breaths, how he tried to hide the fear, how his body still seemed to shrink in on itself as though expecting another blow. But instead of being met with harsh words or coldness, Lucas was met with warmth from both Buddy and Tony. The simple, steady presence of the dog seemed to be working its magic, slowly beginning to soothe Lucas's nerves. Tony crouched down slowly, lowering his height so that he didn't feel so intimidating to the boy. He kept his voice quiet, his movements deliberate, not wanting to overwhelm Lucas. "I'm Tony," he said gently, letting the words hang in the air. "And this here is Buddy." Lucas's gaze flickered briefly to Tony, but his focus remained mostly on Buddy. His lips parted as if he might speak, but no words came out. His eyes darted from Tony to the ground, and he quickly looked back at Buddy. Tony sensed the fear in the boy's hesitation. Lucas wasn't ready to speak, wasn't ready to let anyone in just yet. And Tony understood. He didn't want to force anything, not when the boy was so fragile, so broken from what he had already been through. Instead, he remained kneeling, his posture open and non-threatening. The snow continued to fall around them, its soft touch adding a quiet calm to the otherwise tense atmosphere. Tony could feel the weight of the moment, the responsibility of ensuring Lucas felt safe, truly safe, after everything he had endured. "I'm not going anywhere," Tony said softly, offering Lucas a comforting, reassuring smile. "And Buddy won't either. We'll stay here with you, okay?" Lucas's eyes flickered toward Tony again, then back to Buddy. For the first time, Tony saw a slight relaxation in the boy's shoulders, a softening of his body's tense lines. The boy wasn't ready to talk, but he was starting to trust, even if just a little. The walls Lucas had built around himself were still high, still thick with fear, but the small steps were there. Buddy let out a quiet sigh, his large body shifting closer to Lucas. The dog seemed to know that his presence was enough for now, that it was time for patience, not pressure. Tony followed Buddy's lead, keeping his distance, but remaining there, grounded, offering a steady hand without expectation. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Tony stayed crouched in the snow, his voice soft and steady, never pushing, never rushing. He didn't want to overwhelm Lucas, who was still so guarded, so filled with fear. He knew better than to expect an immediate breakthrough. Patience was key. Tony had learned that much from his years of service. Trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned, step by step, moment by moment. Buddy sat beside him, still and calm, his body a quiet presence that seemed to absorb the tension in the air. The German shepherd's eyes never left Lucas, but there was no hint of aggression, no demand for attention. Buddy simply stayed with the boy, offering his presence, his steadiness. The dog's relaxed posture, the way he tilted his head slightly, said more than any words could. He wasn't here to protect Lucas with force. He was here to protect with patience, to let the boy feel safe in his own time. Lucas's gaze flickered between Tony and Buddy, his eyes still cautious but less frantic than before. The tremble in his hands had softened, the tightness in his shoulders had loosened just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. Tony kept his tone gentle, choosing his words carefully. "We don't have to talk about anything you don't want to," Tony said, his voice low and reassuring. "But if you ever feel like you want to talk, I'm here to listen. No pressure, okay?" Lucas didn't answer, but Tony wasn't looking for words. He was looking for signs that the boy was starting to trust, starting to feel that he was safe. And slowly, Lucas was showing him those signs. His body was still stiff, but there was a quiet shift in his posture, a hint of a softening in his eyes. The walls Lucas had built around himself hadn't come down completely, but the cracks were starting to show. Buddy let out another soft sigh, his body shifting closer to Lucas, but not too close, not forcing anything. The dog's stillness was like a balm to the boy's raw nerves. Buddy knew when to be patient, and Tony was learning to follow his lead. The warmth of the dog's presence seemed to ease the tension in the air, allowing Lucas to relax just enough to feel the safety he hadn't known in so long. The wind had calmed, and the snow fell gently around them, settling quietly on the ground. as if the world was holding its breath in this small, intimate moment. Tony could hear his own heartbeat, steady and strong as he waited for Lucas to take the next step. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He simply offered his presence, his steady voice, and the quiet understanding that no matter what, he wasn't going anywhere. For a long time, Lucas didn't speak. He kept his eyes on Buddy, watching the dog's calm demeanor, and Tony could see the tiniest shift in the boy's expression. His face softened just a little, his lips parting as though he might say something, but he stayed silent. And Tony, patient as always, didn't speak either. Sometimes, silence was the safest space to let trust grow, without the pressure of words. Tony's hand stayed where it was, just within reach, but not too close. He didn't want to startle the boy. Lucas hadn't yet taken the final step toward trusting him, but he was getting closer. The space between them was filled with a quiet understanding. Lucas was starting to let go, just a little. The night was still and cold, but the small flicker of trust that had started to form between them warmed the space, just enough to make it feel like something might change. Something good. The quiet of the night was broken by the sound of sirens in the distance. The flashing blue and red lights cut through the falling snow, their bright beams illuminating the street in sharp contrast to the gentle, peaceful atmosphere around them. Tony stood up, keeping an eye on Lucas, who hadn't moved much but was now watching the police cars approach with wide eyes. The boy still didn't speak, but Tony could feel his nervous energy, his body rigid with uncertainty. The patrol car pulled to a stop, and 2 officers stepped out. The first was a woman, Officer Laura Mitchell, with a calm yet determined expression. The second officer, a man named James Carter, was broad-shouldered, his presence reassuring yet firm. They both approached Tony, but their attention quickly shifted to Lucas, who remained sitting, his small body huddled against Buddy, seeking comfort from the dog's steady presence. "Are you all right, kid?" Officer Mitchell asked softly, kneeling down in front of Lucas, making sure to keep her movements slow and non-threatening. Lucas didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward her, a glimmer of recognition in his gaze. He was starting to understand that these people were here to help, even if it was hard for him to let go of the fear that had kept him silent for so long. Tony nodded at the officers, briefly explaining how he had found Lucas alone outside, trembling in the cold. "I don't know what's been going on inside the house," Tony added, his voice tense, "but something's not right." Officer Mitchell gave him a nod, then turned back to Lucas, who still wasn't speaking. She stood up slowly, her movements measured. "We're going to get you out of here, kid," she said gently but firmly, ensuring that Lucas didn't feel rushed or overwhelmed. "You're safe now." The officers had been briefed on the call and quickly moved to investigate the house. Tony remained close to Lucas, not wanting to leave his side. As the officers made their way to the front door, Tony could hear the sound of them knocking, their voices muffled in the cold night air. It didn't take long before the door opened. The woman who answered, her face calm but with a slight tension in her posture, was Sarah. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cool, almost detached. There was a certain sharpness in her gaze, an attempt to maintain control over the situation, but it didn't fool Tony. He had seen enough in his time as a soldier to recognize the signs of someone trying to hide something. Officer Mitchell identified herself and Carter, showing their badges. "We need to speak with you about your son," Officer Mitchell began, her voice steady but authoritative. "There's been an incident, and we need to ask you a few questions." Sarah's eyes flickered with momentary surprise, but she quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "He's not my son," she corrected. "He's my stepson, but I'm sure he's fine. He just has a tendency to throw tantrums and run off when he doesn't get his way." Tony felt a wave of disgust wash over him. Sarah's words were cold, dismissive, but not unexpected. He had already seen the lack of compassion in her behavior toward Lucas, but now there was more to uncover. Officer Carter stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We've received footage from the security cameras around the property," he said. "We'd like to take a look at that footage now." The expression on Sarah's face shifted. It was subtle, but Tony saw it. A flicker of unease. She stood still for a moment, as though debating whether to comply or try to argue. But in the end, she didn't protest. She simply nodded, stepping aside to let them inside. As the officers reviewed the footage, the truth that had been hidden for so long began to surface. The video showed Sarah shoving Lucas out the door, the small boy falling onto the porch steps. The moment was captured in stark detail, the coldness of Sarah's actions undeniable. There was no denying the violence of her push, no justification for what had happened. The images were clear, damning. Tony's heart clenched as he watched the video on Officer Carter's tablet. The footage didn't need words to speak for itself. The rawness of the moment, the cruelty in Sarah's actions was enough to show that Lucas had been living in fear, trapped in a home that should have been a place of safety. Officer Mitchell turned to Sarah, her face hardening. "You've just exposed yourself," she said, her voice low but resolute. "This is not a tantrum. This is abuse." Sarah's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, her lips pressed into a thin line. She remained silent, her eyes darting around as though searching for an escape, but there was no way out. The truth had been revealed. As the officers continued their questioning of Sarah, Lucas sat quietly in the corner of the room, his gaze distant, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His eyes were downcast, not meeting anyone's, as if he were trying to disappear into himself. The world around him felt both too loud and too quiet at the same time. The harsh light above seemed to close in on him, amplifying the weight of everything he had endured. The images from the camera, the ones that had exposed the truth about Sarah, brought a flood of memories rushing back to Lucas. The violent push, the coldness in Sarah's eyes as she locked the door behind him, were just the latest in a long line of cruel moments he had experienced. The images on the screen were clear, but they didn't capture everything that had happened in that house. Lucas remembered the times he had tried to speak up, to ask for something simple, something as basic as love or comfort, and how his words had always been met with scorn. Sarah's harsh words, her angry shouts when he dropped something, when he didn't sit up straight at the dinner table, when he asked too many questions about things he didn't understand. The slaps, the scolding, the long silences that followed when he didn't comply, those were all the things Lucas had learned to expect in the house he called home. But now, as the truth began to surface, he realized that he had been living in fear for so long that it had become second nature. Lucas remembered the first time Sarah hit him. It had been an accident, or so he had thought. He had dropped a glass, and before he knew it, her hand was on his cheek, hard and quick. It wasn't a slap of affection, it was a slap of anger, a slap of disdain. And then when he tried to explain, tried to say it was a mistake, she had told him, "But stop lying, you never learn." That night, he hadn't cried. He had learned that crying made things worse. Sarah had said so with a voice that was as cold as ice. "Crying won't fix anything," she had told him. As the memories flooded back, Lucas's heart ached, a pain so sharp and deep that he thought it might consume him. But he didn't cry. He couldn't. He had learned long ago that his tears were just fuel for Sarah's anger, that they only made everything worse. He had kept the pain inside, hidden beneath the surface, pushing it down until it was buried so deep that he didn't even know how to let it out. He remembered the nights he would lie in bed, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaking of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but most of all, the silence. The silence that filled the house when Sarah was angry, when she ignored him. That silence was the hardest part. It was the silence that told him he didn't matter, that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be good enough. Now, as he sat in the police station, Lucas knew that speaking the truth about everything, about the way Sarah treated him, would only make things worse. It had always been that way. The few times he had tried to speak up, to tell someone about the way Sarah had hurt him, had only resulted in more pain, more scolding, more isolation. No one had ever listened, not in the way he needed them to, and so he had kept quiet, burying his pain deeper and deeper until it felt like it was a part of him. But something was different now. He was safe. He was no longer alone in the cold. He could see that the truth was finally coming to light, that people cared. But it was hard, so hard, to believe that it could be different this time. The room in the police station felt sterile, cold, and impersonal. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting an almost clinical glow on the scene. Lucas sat quietly in the corner, his small body still, his eyes downcast. He could hear the muffled voices of Officer Mitchell and Officer Carter, but he couldn't make out their words. His mind was elsewhere, swirling with a mixture of confusion, fear, and disbelief. Even now, with all the evidence against Sarah, he couldn't fully wrap his mind around the fact that he wasn't alone anymore, that someone was finally standing up for him. Sarah, on the other hand, was sitting across from the officers, her posture stiff and rigid. Her arms were crossed, her jaw clenched, and her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at the officers with a look that seemed to challenge them. Despite the situation, she maintained a semblance of control, as if trying to hold on to some shred of authority. But it wasn't working. Not anymore. Officer Mitchell spoke first, her voice calm but firm. "Sarah, we have the security footage from your house. It clearly shows you pushing Lucas out the door, leaving him in the cold. We also have multiple witnesses who have seen the way you've treated him. This is not a case of a child throwing a tantrum. This is abuse." Sarah's face flickered with a brief flash of panic, but she quickly masked it. She took a deep breath and began her defense, her words laced with defensive denial. "That wasn't what happened," she insisted, her voice sharp. "He was being difficult, refusing to listen. I told him to go to his room and he ran out. I didn't want him to be out there, but he wouldn't listen. He's always like this, always making things worse." Her words tumbled out almost too quickly, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince the officers. But no matter how many times she repeated her version of events, the evidence from the security cameras told a different story. Officer Carter stepped forward, his voice steady and unwavering. "We've watched the footage, Sarah. The camera clearly shows you locking the door behind Lucas, leaving him out in the snow, alone. This is not the first time we've had reports about your behavior toward him. Your actions are abusive, and we have enough evidence to charge you." Sarah's face paled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The air in the room felt heavy with the truth she had tried so hard to hide. The cameras didn't lie. The footage was damning, showing her actions in stark detail. The shove, the closed door, the sound of Lucas's small knock, the locked door that kept him outside. She tried to recover, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke again. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she said, her tone weak now, more pleading than defensive. "I was frustrated, but he's always so difficult to handle. He never listens. I didn't know what else to do." But her words felt hollow, empty. The damage was done. The truth was already out, and no amount of justification would erase the pain she had caused. Officer Mitchell didn't respond right away. She simply let the silence stretch between them, letting Sarah's words hang in the air, useless in the face of the undeniable evidence. "I know it's hard," Officer Mitchell finally said, her voice still calm but firm. "But you need to understand that what you did wasn't just a moment of frustration. This is something far more serious. And now, you're going to have to face the consequences." Sarah sat there, her shoulders slumping slightly. Her defense had crumbled, and for the first time she seemed unsure of herself, her control slipping away. The officers exchanged a look, their duty clear. They were ready to move forward with the case. Tony, who had been standing quietly in the background, watching everything unfold, felt a surge of relief mixed with anger. Relief that the truth was finally being recognized, but anger that it had taken so long for Lucas to be heard. He turned to look at Lucas, who hadn't moved from his seat in the corner. The boy was still silent, his gaze distant, but there was something different now. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes, a small spark of belief that things might change, that the truth was no longer hidden, The officers were wrapping up their questioning of Sarah, but Tony knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to uncover, and the journey ahead wouldn't be easy for Lucas. But for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of light ahead, a sign that things could be different. The room grew tense as the silence between Sarah and the officers stretched on. Sarah sat there, rigid and unmoving, her eyes cold and calculating, betraying none of the guilt or fear that Tony had expected. She had been caught in a lie, caught in her cruelty, but there was no sign of remorse in her demeanor. She didn't flinch when Officer Mitchell spoke to her, didn't waver when the charges were made clear. Instead, she sat with a composed, almost defiant air, as if she believed that somehow she could still control the situation. "I'm just tired of all this," Sarah said finally, her voice flat, as if the words were a rehearsed defense rather than an expression of true feeling. "He's always been difficult. I didn't ask for this responsibility. I didn't ask to be his mother." Her words were cold, dismissive, a reflection of everything she had failed to be as a parent. Officer Mitchell's eyes narrowed, but her tone remained firm. "You're not being asked to be his mother, Sarah," she said, her voice unwavering. "You're being held accountable for your actions. This isn't about responsibility, it's about abuse, and you can't hide from that." Sarah shifted in her seat, but it was clear that her facade was beginning to crack. She clenched her fists in her lap, her fingers white from the pressure, but there was still no real acknowledgement of the pain she had caused Lucas. She was trying to control the narrative, trying to maintain some shred of power over a situation that had already spiraled beyond her reach. Meanwhile, Lucas sat silently in the corner, his small form practically invisible in the oversized chair. His eyes remained fixed on Tony and Buddy, but he didn't speak. He hadn't said a word since they had entered the station, and now, sitting here in this room filled with grown-ups and tension, he felt smaller than ever. The events of the evening, the shouting, the cold, the terror of being abandoned by Sarah, had settled deep within him like a weight he could hardly bear. But Tony's steady presence, the warmth of Buddy beside him, offered a small shred of comfort. It wasn't much, but it was something. The boy had learned long ago to be silent, to keep his feelings to himself, but now, for the first time, he wasn't alone. The comforting silence of Tony and Buddy's presence made him feel in a strange way that he was being seen, that maybe, just maybe, his pain wasn't invisible anymore. Tony, for his part, could feel the heaviness in the room. The tension between Sarah and the officers, her refusal to acknowledge her actions, only seemed to deepen Lucas's silence. Tony couldn't help but glance at the boy every so often, watching the slight movements in his posture, the way his shoulders were pulled inward, his eyes downcast. It was as if Lucas had withdrawn even further into himself, retreating into a world where words and explanations didn't matter. Despite the obvious strain in the room, Tony refused to let his gaze leave Lucas for too long. He needed the boy to know that he was there, not just as a witness, not just as someone trying to bring the truth to light, but as someone who genuinely cared about his well-being. The reality of what Lucas had been through was still hard for Tony to comprehend, but he was determined to stay present, to offer the boy whatever small sense of security he could. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly unsure of how to proceed with Sarah's continued resistance. Officer Carter, who had remained relatively quiet, finally spoke. "We have enough to press charges. There's no denying what's on the footage. The question is, Sarah, how long do you think you can keep lying?" Sarah's lips tightened, her eyes flashing with a hint of frustration, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze to the floor, unwilling to meet their eyes. Tony couldn't help but feel a surge of anger at her behavior, the same anger that had built up earlier when he first saw the cruelty in her eyes. But now, it was more than that. It was a protective instinct. He wanted to shield Lucas from this, from her, from the world that had failed to protect him. But Lucas wasn't saying anything. He hadn't said a word, not even when the truth was right in front of him. The weight of the silence hung between them all. The silence in the room pressed down on Tony, making it feel even colder than the snowstorm outside. He couldn't help but watch Sarah sitting there, her expression stone cold and defiant. She still hadn't shown a shred of remorse, no flicker of guilt. It was as if the reality of what she had done hadn't even registered with her. Tony's jaw tightened with frustration, a hot wave of anger rising in his chest. He wanted to confront her, to demand that she show some sign of humanity, some acknowledgement of the pain she had caused Lucas, but he knew better than to let his emotions cloud his judgment. His military training kicked in, grounding him despite the turmoil inside. Patience, control. These were lessons he had learned over years of service. In the field, things could get chaotic, but you had to stay level-headed. You had to assess the situation calmly, no matter how hard it was. And now, as he sat there, watching Sarah's cold deflection, he knew that this was no different. Lucas's safety was paramount. The anger he felt toward Sarah, toward everything she had done, would only cloud his ability to help the boy. Tony forced himself to breathe slowly, letting the tension in his body ease. His mind replayed the countless situations from his military days where keeping cool under pressure had been the difference between life and death. The same mentality applied now. The situation was volatile, but it required steady hands, a steady mind. He couldn't afford to let his feelings of anger and frustration take control. As he sat there, trying to compose himself, Tony's thoughts shifted to Lucas. His heart ached for the boy. He thought about the expression on Lucas's face, the silence in his eyes, the way he seemed to shrink into the corner of the room. That silence had haunted Tony since the moment he first laid eyes on the boy, sitting alone in the snow. It was a silence filled with fear, with years of suppressed pain. And now, in this very room, Lucas still hadn't said a word, hadn't shared the weight of what he had been through. Tony's chest tightened as he thought about Lucas's life, about the things he had endured in the years that Sarah had been in his life. No child should have to go through what Lucas had. No child should feel that the world is a place of coldness and abandonment. The thought of Lucas, isolated and alone, enduring the cruelty of a woman who should have been his protector, filled Tony with a sense of resolve. The boy was still so small, still so vulnerable. And yet he had survived. Tony's anger flared again, not just at Sarah, but at the world that had let Lucas down. He thought about the countless times he had seen soldiers in desperate situations, soldiers who had been through hell and come out scarred, but still fighting. Lucas, in his own way, had fought through his own hell. And yet he was still just a child, too young to have endured such suffering, too young to have had his life stripped away from him in such a cold, heartless way. The rage that Tony felt now was different than before. It was not just anger. It was the feeling of protection, of wanting to fight for someone who had no voice. He couldn't change what had happened to Lucas, but he could be the one to ensure that this didn't happen again. He could make sure the boy was safe. He could help him heal. As the officers continued their questioning, Tony stood up, the emotions churning inside him, threatening to spill over. He took a slow step toward Lucas, who was still sitting quietly, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. The boy's gaze flickered up to Tony's for a moment, and for the first time there was a hint of something different in his eyes. Maybe it was trust, maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the recognition that he wasn't alone anymore. But whatever it was a start. And that was all Tony needed. Tony's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there watching Lucas. The boy had been through too much. Every inch of Tony's being screamed to do something to make sure that the nightmare of Lucas's life stopped here, right now. He couldn't erase the past, none of them could, but he had the power to protect the boy from any further harm. And that was exactly what he was going to do. The decision came in a flash, clear and unwavering. Tony wasn't going to let Lucas slip through the cracks, wasn't going to let him suffer in silence any longer. He had seen enough, and the anger that had been building inside him now fueled his resolve. Lucas needed a safe place to heal, away from the cruelty that had been inflicted upon him, away from the house that had never felt like home. Turning to the officers, Tony's voice was calm but firm. I want to make sure Lucas gets the help he needs. He's been through enough. I don't think he should go back there. Not tonight, not ever. Officer Mitchell nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. We're going to make sure he's taken care of, but it's going to take time. Tony looked back at Lucas, whose wide eyes were watching him closely. The boy had been so quiet, so withdrawn, but in that moment there was something different in his gaze. A flicker of hope, a flicker of trust. Tony's chest tightened, the weight of the responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just protecting Lucas now. He was helping him rebuild his life. Come on, buddy, Tony said, turning to Buddy, who had been sitting calmly beside him, watching Lucas with patient eyes. The dog's quiet presence had been a comfort to Lucas, and Tony knew that Buddy's role in this healing process was just as important as his own. He crouched down, resting a hand on Buddy's head, offering a silent reassurance. Buddy let out a soft, low growl as if acknowledging that his job wasn't done yet. He stood, his strong body shifting gracefully beside Tony. The German shepherd's eyes never left Lucas, as if the dog understood just how much the boy needed him. Tony knelt down in front of Lucas, offering him a small but reassuring smile. We're going to get you to a safe place, Lucas. No more fear, no more pain. I promise. The boy's eyes flickered between Tony and Buddy, but there was no hesitation this time. His small, trembling hands reached out to Tony, and in that moment, Tony could feel the weight of all the silent cries Lucas had kept hidden for so long. It wasn't much, just a slight shift in the boy's posture, a softening in his face. But it was enough. It was the first step toward trust, the first sign that Lucas might believe, for the first time in his life, that someone was truly there for him. Are you ready? Tony asked gently, not wanting to rush him, but needing to get Lucas to safety as quickly as possible. Lucas didn't speak, but he nodded slightly, his eyes still downcast but filled with something new, something hopeful. Buddy trotted over to him, nudging his hand gently with his nose as if to say, "You're not alone." Lucas hesitated at first, then slowly reached out to touch Buddy's fur. The dog's warmth seemed to calm him, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas allowed himself to relax just a little. Tony stood, offering a hand to Lucas. Let's go. With Buddy leading the way, the three of them walked out of the police station and into the night, leaving behind the cold and the fear. The snow continued to fall gently around them, as if the world itself was wiping away the past, giving them a fresh start. They headed to a place where Lucas could begin anew, a place where he wouldn't have to hide, where he could heal. And as Tony looked down at Lucas, walking beside him with Buddy at their side, he couldn't help but feel that the boy was no longer alone. There was hope now, and with hope, there was a chance for everything to change. The night felt like it was pressing forward with a quiet intensity, the snow falling steadily around them as they made their way down the street. Tony couldn't help but glance at Lucas every so often, watching the small changes in the boy. His shoulders were a little less tense now, his steps a little more sure. They had just left the police station, and although the future was uncertain for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of something different. Hope. But just as they were about to leave the neighborhood and head toward the safe house, the sound of a phone ringing interrupted the moment. Officer Carter's voice crackled through the speaker as he answered, his tone immediately serious. "We've got something new," Carter said quickly. "The security footage we reviewed earlier, it's just the beginning. We found more evidence, additional cameras on the property. We need to bring you in right away." Tony's heart sank. He had hoped that the worst of it was behind them, that Sarah's actions would be fully exposed, but the evidence coming in now only confirmed his worst fears. There was more to Sarah's behavior than they had anticipated, more than what they had already uncovered. It seemed that the truth was even darker than they had imagined. Tony and Lucas were already in the car on their way to a safe location, but when the new evidence surfaced, it was clear that the case wasn't going to be as simple as they'd hoped. The new footage painted a clearer picture of Sarah's cruelty. Small but significant moments of mistreatment toward Lucas that hadn't been visible before. In addition to the violent shove, the footage showed Sarah's disregard for Lucas's basic needs, her harsh words, and the cold indifference in her actions. The abuse wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional too. At the police station, Officer Mitchell was already coordinating with Child Protective Services. She was calm but resolute as she explained the new developments to Tony. "This isn't just about the incident tonight," she said. "There are other signs of long-term neglect. This case goes deeper than we thought." Tony's chest tightened at the words, but he didn't allow himself to show his emotions. He couldn't. He was focused on Lucas now. He needed to make sure the boy was okay, that he was safe. The investigation was ongoing, and they were already moving quickly to ensure Sarah would face the consequences of her actions. Lucas, who had been quiet throughout the drive, looked up at Tony with a mixture of uncertainty and something else. Maybe fear, or maybe the hope he had felt earlier. Tony glanced at the boy, trying to gauge how much he could share with him. The road ahead was still long, but Tony wanted Lucas to know he wasn't alone. He couldn't let the boy feel the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. As they arrived at the safe house, Tony noticed a subtle change in Lucas. There was a lightness in his eyes now, a softening in his posture, even though his journey was far from over. They had reached a turning point. The walls that Lucas had built around himself were slowly starting to come down. "We're almost there, Lucas," Tony said quietly, pulling into the driveway. "You're safe now, and we'll take it one step at a time, all right?" Lucas nodded, though he didn't speak. For the first time, the boy seemed to understand. Maybe not fully, but enough. He was starting to trust. And that, Tony knew, was the beginning of a new chapter for him. The safe house was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos and fear that had consumed Lucas's life for so long. The walls were soft, painted in warm shades of light yellow and cream, and there was a faint smell of fresh linens in the air. A space where the world outside felt distant, and for the first time Lucas felt like maybe, just maybe, he could breathe. Tony and Buddy had settled into a routine, creating a calm atmosphere around Lucas. Tony had set up a small, cozy space for the boy by the window, where sunlight filtered in gently through the curtains. The little boy sat near the window, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the street, but he no longer seemed to be as afraid. Buddy was always nearby, his large form resting quietly on the floor, a steady, calming presence. The dog had been Lucas's first comfort, and it wasn't lost on Tony how much Buddy had already begun to heal the boy. There was something about Buddy's simple, unwavering loyalty that offered Lucas a level of peace he hadn't known before. The dog didn't demand anything from him. He simply existed, a source of quiet strength. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Lucas was no longer alone. There were no locked doors, no cold silences, no harsh words, and yet there was still something within him that felt unreachable. He wasn't ready to speak about what had happened, not yet. The weight of his silence hung in the air, a reminder of the pain he carried. But over the next few days, as Tony patiently sat beside him, spoke softly, and offered him time to adjust, Lucas began to open up piece by piece. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but there was something in Tony's presence, a warmth, a steadiness, that allowed Lucas to feel safe enough to speak. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of being ignored or dismissed. Tony wasn't going anywhere. One evening, as the light of the day began to fade, Lucas looked up at Tony, his small fingers fiddling with the hem of his sleeve. Buddy was lying at his feet, resting peacefully. Tony sat across from him, waiting, patient, never rushing. It had taken days for Lucas to speak at all, and even now, there was a quiet hesitation in the air. "Do you want to talk about it?" Tony asked gently, his voice low and encouraging. Lucas hesitated. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment it seemed as if he might retreat back into himself. But then, without looking up, Lucas's voice broke through the quiet. soft and broken. "Sarah, she pushed me." His voice trembled as he said the words, and his gaze never met Tony's. His eyes were focused on the floor, the memory still too raw to face head on. Tony didn't move, didn't speak, just let Lucas's words linger in the space between them. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was the first time Lucas had said anything about what had happened, the first time the silence had been broken. "She locked the door. I tried to knock, but she didn't open it. She never opens the door when she gets mad." Lucas's voice faltered, and he pulled his knees up to his chest, hugging them tightly. She says it's my fault." Tony's heart clenched at the vulnerability in Lucas's voice. He could feel the weight of the boy's words, the anguish he had been carrying alone for so long. But Lucas was finally speaking, finally releasing the burden he had kept silent for so long. Buddy, sensing Lucas's discomfort, lifted his head and moved closer, resting his chin gently on Lucas's knee. The dog's presence was comforting, grounding, as if to say, "You're not alone. I'm here." Tony leaned forward slightly, his tone warm and reassuring. "It's not your fault, Lucas. You never deserved any of that. You did nothing wrong, and you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Lucas's eyes flickered to Tony's for the briefest moment, a glimmer of something, maybe trust, maybe hope, shining through the fear. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Lucas was beginning to let go of the heavy silence that had haunted him for so long. Tony's hand rested lightly on the table between them, offering his presence without pressure. "You're safe here, Lucas, and when you're ready, we'll take it one step at a time." Buddy gave a soft whine, pressing against Lucas's leg, as if offering his own silent support. Lucas's lips trembled slightly, but for the first time in a long while, the weight of his past didn't feel so suffocating. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack, and the fear that had controlled him for so long was slowly being replaced by something new, something powerful: hope. The quiet in the room was filled with a gentle intensity, the kind of silence that hung heavy with unspoken truths. Lucas sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, his small hands wrapped tightly around them, as though trying to hold on to something familiar. Buddy was still by his side, his large body pressed against Lucas's leg, offering the quiet, steady comfort that only a loyal dog could provide. Tony watched the boy carefully, knowing that despite the progress they'd made, the real challenge was just beginning. Lucas had shared more than he ever had before, but Tony could sense that something still held him back. The weight of his past, the years of silence, and the fear of the unknown were all still there, lingering beneath the surface. And now, as Lucas began to speak, he had to confront the reality that sharing his story would change everything. Tony leaned forward, his voice low and reassuring. "Lucas," he began gently, "I know it's scary to talk about all this. I know that what you've shared already feels like a lot, but I want you to know something important. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're not alone." Lucas's eyes, which had been locked on the floor, flickered up to Tony's for the briefest moment. His lips trembled and his chest rose and fell rapidly, as if he were struggling to take a breath. The fear in his eyes was palpable, like a shadow that had followed him for far too long. "I know you're scared, kid," Tony continued, his voice soft but firm. "I know that everything you're feeling right now is overwhelming, but you don't have to carry it by yourself anymore. You're safe here. And that means you don't have to hide it. You don't have to keep it inside any longer." Tony's hand hovered just above the table, offering the boy a sense of security, but he didn't push. He let Lucas process the words, let the reassurance settle in slowly. The boy had spent years hiding his pain, and now, Tony knew, it wasn't just about speaking up. It was about facing the fear that had controlled his life for so long. Buddy, sensing the tension in the air, shifted closer, his body pressing even more firmly against Lucas's side. The dog's presence was a constant reminder that Lucas wasn't alone. Buddy wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't demanding trust or answers. He was simply there, offering his silent support, grounding the boy with his calm demeanor and warm, steady presence. Lucas's eyes remained fixed on Buddy for a long moment, as if drawing strength from the dog. His small hands were still clenched tightly around his knees, but the shaking had lessened. The weight of his fear, though still present, felt lighter. It was as if, in the presence of Tony and Buddy, the fear that had kept him silent for so long had started to loosen its grip. "I'm here for you, Lucas," Tony said, his voice gentle but full of conviction. "And so is Buddy. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You can let go of the past. You're safe now." The words, simple as they were, seemed to sink in. Lucas's shoulders, which had been so tightly wound, relaxed just a little. He looked at Buddy once more, his hands slowly reaching out to rest on the dog's head. Buddy let out a soft sigh and nudged his head into Lucas's touch, as if offering a quiet reassurance. Tony watched the small exchange with a sense of quiet pride. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Lucas was starting to trust. He was beginning to let go of the walls he had built around himself. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt a shift inside. The fear that had defined his life wasn't gone, but it didn't hold him the same way anymore. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The days that followed Sarah's arrest were a blur of change. It wasn't just the police investigation or the legal process that weighed on Lucas's mind. It was the quiet that surrounded him now, the absence of fear, the unfamiliar sense of security. For the first time in a long while, he didn't have to worry about what was waiting for him at home. The burden of silence had been lifted, and in its place, there was space. Space for healing, for growth, for something better. Tony had made sure that Lucas was placed in a safe home, away from the trauma he had lived through for so long. The transition wasn't easy. It never was for a child who had been through what Lucas had, but Tony made it clear from the beginning. Lucas was not alone anymore. The new house was warm, a stark contrast to the coldness Lucas had known. It was a place where the air felt lighter, where the walls weren't closing in on him. There were other children here, other kids who had experienced their own struggles but were now in the care of people who genuinely wanted to help. The walls of this house weren't just for protection, they were for growth. For the first time, Lucas felt like he could breathe freely. There was no tension in the air, no cruelty waiting to unfold. Lucas was shown his new room, a small, cozy space with soft colors and a bed that felt like it might actually be for him. He hesitated at first, unsure if he could truly let go of the fear that had been so deeply embedded in him. But Tony was there, just as he had been through everything else, assuring him that this was a place where he could feel safe, where he could rest without fear. Tony sat beside him on the bed, Buddy at his feet. "You're safe here, Lucas," Tony said, his voice soft but resolute. "No one is going to hurt you anymore. This is your new home now." Buddy, sensing the weight of the moment, pressed his head into Lucas's lap. The dog's presence, steady and calm, seemed to anchor the boy, reminding him that the fear that had once controlled him no longer had a hold on him. The dog's warm, reassuring touch was just what Lucas needed. Over the next few days, Lucas began to open up more, not with words yet, but with small actions. He would sit with the other children, slowly starting to play, his laughter quieter than it should be for a boy his age, but it was a start. He would draw pictures, creating scenes of a life he had always wished for, one without fear, without cruelty. And each time he looked over at Buddy, who lay beside him, Lucas could feel a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from something. Tony visited him every day, making sure that Lucas knew he wasn't going anywhere. The bond between them had only grown stronger, a steady foundation of trust built from the ground up. And with each visit, Lucas seemed to relax more, a little piece of his old self returning. As time passed, Lucas began to share more of his story with those around him, and the people at the home listened. There were therapists, counselors, people who wanted to help him rebuild. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a beginning, a real beginning. For the first time, Lucas was not running. He wasn't hiding. He was finding his way back to himself slowly, gently, and with a support system that cared for him. The days at the safe house were full of small, quiet victories for Lucas. He was no longer just existing, he was beginning to live again. The weight of his past still lingered, but the walls he had built around himself were crumbling, bit by bit, as he learned to trust the people around him. Every day brought something new, a new friend, a new activity, a new experience. Slowly, Lucas was opening up to the world in ways he had never done before. He met the other children in the home, each with their own story of pain and survival. They had been through their own versions of hell, and for the first time, Lucas wasn't the only one with scars. He found comfort in knowing that he wasn't alone, that there were others who understood the silence, the fear, and the long road to healing. The other kids didn't push him. They simply accepted him as he was, letting him find his place in his own time. Lucas spent his days with crayons and paper, drawing pictures that told stories of a life he wished for, a life where he could be free from fear, where kindness and safety were all he knew. His drawings weren't filled with the darkness of the past anymore. They were bright, filled with color, with small details that spoke of a child reclaiming his world. And Buddy, ever the loyal companion, was by his side through it all. The German Shepherd continued to be Lucas's quiet anchor, always there when the boy needed him most. Buddy didn't require anything. No words, no expectations, just a steady presence that gave Lucas the space to heal at his own pace. The dog followed him around the house, laying at his feet while he drew, and nudging him gently when he seemed lost in thought. There were times when Lucas would whisper to Buddy, telling him things he wasn't ready to share with anyone else, and Buddy, with his calm eyes and unspoken understanding, would listen. Tony's visits continued. He had promised Lucas that he wouldn't disappear, and he kept that promise. With each visit, Tony could see the changes in Lucas and small shifts in his demeanor, a spark of something that hadn't been there before. The boy was becoming less like the frightened child he had first met and more like the kid he was meant to be. He wasn't hiding in fear anymore. He was learning to face the world around him. Tony didn't press Lucas to speak about the past. He didn't have to. The boy had his own timeline, his own pace, and Tony respected that. But there was a new understanding between them now. The bond they shared was no longer just about protection. It was about trust, about knowing that Lucas could walk this path with someone by his side. The other adults in the home, the counselors, the therapists, everyone who had shown Lucas care also played their part in his journey. They were patient, understanding, and they made sure that Lucas had the space to feel his emotions, to express them when he was ready. But it was clear that Tony, Buddy, and the safe house had become Lucas's foundation. They were the ones who helped him rebuild, who showed him that he could face the world without fear. Lucas had come a long way from the boy who had sat alone in the snow, abandoned by the very person who should have protected him. And though his journey was far from over, for the first time he could see a future ahead of him, a future where he was no longer a victim, but a survivor. The first Christmas after everything changed felt different, brighter, warmer, and full of possibility. For Lucas, the holiday had always been a reminder of loneliness, of being left out in the cold, of a life that never felt whole. But this Christmas, everything was different. This time there was no cruel silence, no fear lurking in the corners of the house. This time there was only warmth. The safe house had been decorated with the soft glow of Christmas lights, the kind that twinkled gently in the corners of the room, reflecting the new sense of peace that had begun to settle in Lucas's heart. The scent of pine filled the air, and there were sounds of laughter and activity as the other children played and prepared for the evening. It was a far cry from the empty, cold houses of Lucas's past. Buddy was by his side as always, his tail wagging excitedly as he watched the other children hang ornaments on the tree. The German Shepherd had become more than just a companion. He was a part of the family, a symbol of loyalty and love that Lucas had never experienced before. It was as if the dog could sense the joy in the air, the change in the atmosphere, and he responded with the same warmth that Lucas was beginning to feel. Tony was there too, his presence a constant source of support. He had promised Lucas that he would always be there, and on this Christmas day, he kept that promise with every word, every smile, and every small gesture of care. They spent the day together, playing games, decorating the tree, and simply enjoying the things that Lucas had never allowed himself to enjoy before. Lucas's laughter, though quiet and unsure at first, began to fill the room. He ran around with the other children, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, his body more relaxed than it had ever been. The sound of laughter, the rustling of wrapping paper, and the soft Christmas music in the background created an atmosphere that Lucas had never known. It was the warmth of belonging, of finally feeling at home. As the evening drew near, Tony and Buddy sat with Lucas by the fire. The flickering flames cast a golden light on the room, creating an atmosphere of calm and comfort. Tony wrapped a cozy blanket around Lucas's shoulders, and Buddy lay beside them, his head resting on Lucas's lap. The three of them sat in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a peaceful one, filled with the unspoken understanding that things had changed for the better. "This is the first Christmas I can remember where I'm not alone," Lucas whispered, his voice soft but steady. Tony's heart swelled with pride as he looked at the boy beside him. "You're not alone, Lucas. You never will be again." Buddy lifted his head at the sound of his name, his brown eyes full of trust and affection. Lucas smiled and ran his fingers through the dog's fur. The simple connection between them, man, boy, and dog, was enough to fill the room with warmth. It was a moment of peace, of quiet joy, and of hope for the future. The tree sparkled in the corner, the lights casting a soft glow, and outside the snow continued to fall. But inside there was only warmth, security, and the promise of a new beginning. For the first time in years, Lucas allowed himself to fully embrace the Christmas spirit, no longer a prisoner of his past. He was free to feel joy, to experience love, and to look forward to a future where he wasn't just surviving, but living. As the months passed, Lucas's life began to transform in ways he had never imagined. The pain that had once defined his existence was still there, buried deep beneath the surface, but it was no longer the force that controlled him. With each passing day, Lucas learned new lessons about loyalty, protection, and courage. He was learning to trust, to let go of the past, and most importantly, to believe in the kindness and care that surrounded him. Buddy, the ever-present companion, had become more than just a dog to Lucas. He was a constant source of support, a reminder of the loyalty and protection that Lucas had never known before. The bond between them grew stronger with each day, and Lucas began to understand that loyalty wasn't just something that came with time, it was something that could be earned through actions. Buddy had shown him what it meant to be truly trusted, to be cared for without expectation. And then there was Tony. Tony had been a steady, unwavering presence in Lucas's life. He had shown Lucas what it meant to be protected, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Tony didn't rush him, didn't push him to talk when he wasn't ready, but was always there when Lucas needed him. He had taught Lucas that it was okay to lean on others, to let go of the fear that had kept him isolated for so long. The quiet strength Tony exhibited in every moment was a lesson in courage, a lesson that Lucas would carry with him for the rest of his life. Lucas learned that life wasn't just about surviving, it was about living. The pain he had endured, though still a part of him, didn't have to define him anymore. He realized that while the world could be filled with hardship, it was also filled with moments of joy, of kindness, and of love. The people around him, Tony, Buddy, and the others at the safe house, had shown him that even in the darkest moments there was light to be found. They had shown him that love could heal, that compassion could rebuild the broken pieces of his soul. But more than anything, Lucas learned the power of patience and friendship. The slow, steady process of opening up, of trusting, had been the hardest part of his journey. But as he looked back on the boy who had first stepped into the safe house, fearful, broken, and lost. He saw how far he had come. He had learned that healing wasn't instant. It took time. It took people who cared, people who were willing to stand by you even when it seemed like the pain would never end. His transformation was proof of the strength that resided within him. He had found a way to heal, to move forward, and to embrace the future with hope. The past didn't control him anymore. He was no longer defined by the abuse, the neglect, or the fear that had once gripped him. Instead, he was defined by his resilience, his courage, and the love that had shown him a new way of life. Lucas stood by the window, gazing out at the street. The seasons had changed, and the snow that had once symbolized isolation and fear was now just a peaceful part of the landscape. The world outside looked different to him now, not just a backdrop to his own struggles, but a place of possibility. He had come a long way from the boy who had sat alone in the snow on Christmas Eve, abandoned and terrified. The boy who had once believed that love and safety were only for other people had learned to believe in them again. The days were no longer filled with fear. Lucas had grown stronger, more confident, and for the first time in his life, he was truly beginning to understand the power of love and trust. He no longer had to hide. The past had shaped him, but it didn't define him anymore. He had learned to rebuild, to rise from the ashes of the pain that had once held him captive. Tony and Buddy had been his constant companions in this journey. Tony had been his protector, his guide, but most of all, his friend. Tony had never pushed him, never asked for more than Lucas was ready to give. He had stood by Lucas through every step, offering unwavering support and patience, and Lucas had learned that he could trust him. Buddy, too, had been a crucial part of Lucas's healing. The German Shepherd had been there through the darkest days, offering his quiet, calming presence. Buddy had been more than just a dog. He was a symbol of unconditional love. The bond between the three of them, Tony, Buddy, and Lucas, was one forged not just in need, but in genuine friendship and mutual respect. They were a team now, not just survivors, but people who had come together to heal and to live. Tony entered the room quietly, and Lucas turned to face him, his face breaking into a small but genuine smile. The boy was older now, a bit taller, his shoulders less burdened with the weight of his past. There was a quiet confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The boy who had once shied away from the world was beginning to embrace it, slowly but surely. He had learned that he could face what came next, that he wasn't alone in the world anymore. Tony sat down beside him, and Buddy followed suit, lying at their feet with a soft sigh. The three of them together, silent in the comfort of each other's presence, felt like everything was finally where it was meant to be. "You're doing great, Lucas," Tony said, his voice gentle but full of pride. "I'm proud of you." Lucas nodded, his gaze drifting back to the window. "I never thought I could get here," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "But now, I feel like I can handle whatever comes next." Tony placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, offering the same reassurance he had given him all along. "You've come a long way, kid, and you don't have to face anything alone. We're right here with you." Lucas looked down at Buddy, who gave a soft wag of his tail. The dog's presence was a reminder of how far he had come. There was no longer any fear of being abandoned, no fear of being unloved. He had found his place, his family. The future still held unknowns, but it didn't seem so daunting anymore. Lucas understood now that life was a journey, not one that could be predicted, but one that could be faced with hope. The pain of the past had faded, replaced by the strength of the relationships he had built, by the trust he had learned to give, and by the love he had found in Tony and Buddy. For the first time, Lucas felt that his future wasn't defined by the scars of the past, but by the choices he made moving forward. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. This story of Lucas, Tony, and Buddy is a powerful reminder of the unconditional love and loyalty that animals, especially German Shepherds, bring into our lives. Through the hardships that Lucas endured, Buddy stood by him, not just as a dog, but as a symbol of unwavering support and protection. Buddy's presence was a source of quiet strength for Lucas, teaching him that love doesn't come with conditions and that loyalty can be the key to healing. German Shepherds, known for their intelligence, loyalty, and deep emotional connection to humans, have a unique way of making people feel safe. Buddy's calm demeanor and constant companionship helped Lucas find the courage to trust again and break free from the fear that had once controlled his life. This story highlights the profound bond between humans and animals, where even in the darkest times, love and loyalty can guide us toward light. The message here is clear. Love, whether from a human or an animal, has the power to transform lives. It offers hope, healing, and the strength to face challenges that might otherwise seem insurmountable. Just like Buddy, who remained by Lucas's side without asking for anything in return, love is a force that does not demand perfection, but offers comfort, reassurance, and understanding. As we reflect on this story, let it remind us of the importance of kindness, of offering a hand to those in need, and of the positive impact we can have on each other's lives, whether human or animal. The journey of healing, growth, and trust is one that is best traveled together, with love and loyalty as our guiding light.